Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back. So today I've got a new video for you for suspension tuning mod for your Litehawk Brute, your Litehawk Blast, and the Wltoys l959, l969, and l202. Now these all have a lot of the same parts as we've talked about in other videos, very much compatible to each other, better than 80% of all parts swapped between them. They also have the exact same suspension. Okay, now I've already got the cap off this one. Now, one thing that these things don't have is a lot of upgrade parts. We talked about brushless motors and metal dog bones. But as far as oil shocks go, still haven't found anything yet. I'm going to do some looking around, and I'm going to actually check out some Traxxas shocks, I think, today too. But anyways, in the meantime, sticking with the stock suspension, there's different ways you can mess around with your suspension. Preload spacers, but there's no direct preload spacers for these things. So the Litehawk Igniter and the HSP Ghost at Night, they actually have preload spacers that will overstretch enough to fit on these things without any hassles. So you can buy those, or you can opt out for the zip tie trick, which a lot of guys have done too. Now that's great for making your shock stiffer. What this modification does is act like a rebound system, like an oil shock. Just take a look at a shock on a vehicle, for example. You take the coil spring off the shock on your vehicle, you've got the shock left, and you push down on it and the shaft will slowly come back up. Now with an oil shock, it's a similar sort of deal on an RC. You know, it has resistance, and it should be able to push that shaft back out at least to a certain extent. But the idea is more of a dampener system on the RCs, and that's also controlled by shock oil thickness, how it's going to react. Now I've actually done an oil shock on my Ghost, and actually I did all 4 shocks the other day with some 30 weight oil, and I was actually quite surprised at the amount of oil in those shocks from the factory was next to nothing. So that kind of explains why they suck so much. So anyways, I put some 30 weight in there, and they work great now. And now I get about half the travel, and then the oil will kick in and act as a rebound, etc. So anyways, first thing we have is a shock that's actually taken apart, because this was actually a bad shock right from the beginning. Now the springs, I'm going to show you, the first one is actually out of a bicycle. These are for adjusting when you're doing your setup for your derailleurs, front and rear. The springs act as kind of like a locking system and anti-vibration, so that the screw can't just back out while you're driving. So they're basically like a set spring. Okay. Now these little guys are the perfect diameter to fit on the inside of the shock. So you just drop it right down. Now there's not a lot of length to these, but there are different coil thicknesses of these springs. So you got a lighter set and a heavier set. Now this is the lighter one. Now looking at the actual travel here, just in and out, this still has about half of its travel. So you pull it all the way up, let it go, it's still got half of its travel. So when the shock comes down, it's going to act as a dampener, and it's going to help with that bottoming out issue, but it's going to help it to have a softer downforce when it does hit harder. With the stiffer spring, it's actually, I find it's a little bit better than the lighter one, but it depends on what you're going after, because every time you change to a different spring, even when you're dealing with just the main shocks, or you're adding preload to your shocks, you change the characteristics and handling of that vehicle. So with this thing, if you use this particular spring at this length, you still have your normal half amount of travel that on your regular, you know, just going along the ground, it's going to act the same. Okay, it's when you're hitting harder bumps that this is going to come in handier to help prevent the bottom out, but also give it a little bit more cushion and some pre-kickback up. Now that's just one length of spring. Another one is going to be something you're going to have to find in the hardware store. and you're going to buy these in a lot longer length than this. You're going to have to cut them. Now when you cut them, you'll notice your coil here is nicely tucked in and, you know, supported properly. Now that's the part you want to put to the bottom, because your top edge now is going to be rough, and even to try and collapse this in, I've never had a lot of good luck at re-collapsing springs back in. And then of course you'd have to flatten it out, but not necessary to do. That's the nice thing, because the top of your shock doesn't matter. So drop it in this way. The top of your shock looks like this, so it doesn't matter about that little groove, and it's going to give a little bit of preload with the length on this, and now your shaft is all the way extended like it would be on an actual car. It's fully extended, and it's going to get some good rebound here. Now let's take a look at this same spring sitting in a fully assembled shock. You don't have to remove the shocks, by the way, off your vehicle to do this. There's just one star tip screw. Now on the back of the car, those screws are facing the front. On the front of the car, the screws are facing the front, so very easy access with a star tip screwdriver. So here's the same shock but all assembled. So we'll take this, put that in. Now with the main spring on here and the other one, when you start squeezing them, that's going to be a lot stiffer. Okay, it's kind of like the same idea as adding a preload spacer. Now when you're trying to squish it in all the way, you're going to have not quite a 1/4 of an inch, and it will not bottom out. Now if you're going for the effect where it cannot bottom out at all, this would be actually a good way to do that. However, what you are also doing is adding preload to it, so it's stiffening it up, which means when you start stiffening up your shock too much, you basically also lighten things up. Okay, so you're going to have an easier time for spin outs, even with the monster truck tires on that Brute or the l969. So you want to watch how much tension you put. You need that still some softness in here so that your rear end can squat a bit and the tires can dig in for traction. But this is just to give you an idea. So if you've got about a 1/4 of an inch here, then we can actually clip some more off of here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my clippers. Now with having a 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to cut, let's start with 2 coils. So 2 coils are now gone. Drop that back in. Now the cap is not under any kind of pressure to go back on. Still a little stiff. And this is where you got to tune it. So that means it's still fully extended. Now this is what you're going to have to go through when you start doing this. But you'll have to pick up your springs, like I said, for your other springs at a hardware store. So there goes another 2 coils. Okay, so now this is going to allow us a little bit of space. Still not completely bottoming out. And it didn't really stiffen it up a whole lot. But we still got just a little bit on here for tension. So let's take off 2 more coils. You want to have a little bit of play space. Just a little. Okay. Now we've got the space, and we just barely hit the bottom out area, so it doesn't quite completely bottom out. It gives us that squatting room we need, so we're all good. Now let's take a look at this same shock but without the coil in the way and just see how the piston's gonna actually perform. So fully extended. So we've got about half the piston showing. So we actually need to have just a little more than half the piston showing. So I should have actually only cut 1 coil off that time. But you get the idea on how to tune these up, and it helps a lot for the performance of your vehicle and helps prevent a lot of that chassis slap bottom out stuff. But anyways, that's the mod. That's how it works. So you can use the bicycle part springs off of derailleurs. Now if you've got some spare derailleurs kicking around the house, you should be able to just grab those and get them for free. Or go to your bike shop, pick them up, and you can buy them as separate parts. Go to the hardware store, get those longer coil springs, and then just custom cut them to how you want it to react. Now if you want a stiffer spring ride and you want to keep the looks the same and you don't have the preload spacers, well then definitely go with the longer length. Stiffen them right up. You're guaranteed you won't get that bottom out at all. But then just be aware, like I said, you're going to change the characteristics and how that vehicle handles. But when you have that extra space in the shaft, so the shaft can drop about a quarter of the way, because you only want it to drop about a quarter of the way on free drop, and that gives just enough for the rear end to squat properly and dig in and still handle pretty much the same way it always did, but with the extra benefit when you're going into a nice steep corner and leaning in. That's all taken care of with the weight. The bumps are going to be taken care of with the harder bumps, and like I said, you should be pretty much able to eliminate the bottom out and chassis slapping the chassis if you do it right. So anyways, that's our little modification. Now when I do get my camera back, because my high def camera is out being repaired right now, I will do some running videos of how these things are tuned. I did stiffer springs in my Brute, and I did the lighter coil spring that I showed you in my l959 buggy, which is your Blast and l202, and we'll just see how the ride is now affected and how they perform differently with those two, and just so that you get an idea. But in the meantime, you know, play and do it yourself and see how you like it, and mess around with different tensions, different springs. Springs are really cheap, you know, so, and all you need is a set of side cutters, and there you go. You can have a lot of fun and tune her up. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.